Hello, I'm Amara Jones here at the Bioneers Conference, reporting with FSTV in their special coverage of this annual conference now in its 30th year, which takes a look at how we as human beings can live in balance with ourselves, with each other, and with the surrounding world, and what the surrounding world, the environment, has to teach us about how to do all of those three things. And so it is, of course, fitting and necessary for us to talk to one of the co-founders of this amazing conference, and that is Kenny Ausubel. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you, Amara.
Where we will go through what these 30 years have been all about.
I
Has
was
it been a
hoping
blur?
you knew.
Has it been a blur?
Yeah, kind of.
Yeah, I would imagine.
Yeah.
One of the things that you have mentioned to me in the past, this is our third year actually doing these interviews right before the conference starts. And last year, after we were here just after people who had been burned out of their homes,
Right.
Literally in this conference center, just days before the conference. There was a question last year of whether or not the conference could even take place as a result of that. And quite literally, as the smoke was clearing, we interviewed. And I asked you whether or not you were hopeful, and you said that you were more hopeful in many ways than you'd been last year. And I'm wondering if you're still in that same place 1 year later.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky question, but overall, yeah, I am. I mean, one thing is for sure, which is climate chaos and extreme inequality are getting worse fast, and people are rising up in ever larger numbers at the same time, making and demanding change, and it's bigger than it was a year ago, that's for sure, and the problems are escalating. It's a kind of a game of beat the reaper here. It's a question, the thing that we need most is what we have least of, which is time. If we had, 50 years, I'd be more optimistic in that sense. Although to me, optimism and pessimism are just kind of futures trading. Nobody knows what the future will hold.
That's right.
And so much depends on what we do, on our agency at
That's
this
right.
point. And, the premise of Bioneers since day one was that nature has a profound capacity for healing and for
That's
self-healing
right.
when given the chance, right? It's all of, the key word is regeneration. That's what nature does, Even a fire is a regenerative mechanism. It comes back with renewed fertility. So the solutions in nature surpass our conception of what's even possible. We're just barely beginning to scratch the surface. And things like what Paul Hawken has been doing with Project Drawdown, which was is really the North Star of goals of, we can't stay at the level of CO2 in the atmosphere that we have. That's the point. So beginning to draw it down out of the atmosphere and sequester it where it belongs in plants and trees and soil, and this is clearly the ticket. And as Drawdown lays out, we actually can do it. We have what we need and know what to do to begin that process immediately. So all of that is at hand. When you really drill down, I think the climate crisis is basically the biggest political failure in human history. And so this is political above all, to me.
But I wonder as well if you think that it is also a spiritual and ethical and a moral crisis. And what I mean by that is that there have been some, but there have been relatively few human civilizations who decide to make war on the place that they live, And for all of the ones that did, it didn't turn out very well. And one of the things that Jared Diamond talks about in his book, Collapse, when he focuses on a civilization that did do that, the one on Easter Island that had been populated by trees, and then as the trees, which were the basis for everything, it's the way that people dug out canoes in order to be able to get food, it's the way in which people were to move stones and have those wonderful monuments, etc., is that he said he always speculates what was the conversation between the last two people that cut down the last tree on the island, right? What did they say to themselves? And I'm wondering what you think are the underpinnings beyond political. Beyond political, what are the failures in how we have gotten to this point?
Well, I think, on one level, what you're asking is it's a crisis of worldviews. And it's a worldview of separation versus a worldview of interbeing and interdependence.
That's right.
And that's been what's driven the so-called modern worldview for about the last 500 years, if not more.
That's right.
And it's that delusion of separation. Because once you know that you are the water and you are the air and you are the trees, It makes it a lot harder to commodify and objectify things, including people, at that level. So I think that's at the core of it. And then, Jared Diamond also talks about the politics quite a bit, that these people were making, the elites basically were making war on each other, building monuments, paying
Right.
each other off. I mean,
That's right.
so there was also all of that, everything that we see every day now. you
Right.
know. But I think, in many ways it still comes down to capitalism and to lawyers, guns, and money. Most people do not want this. This is not the world people want that we're living in. It's being forced on us. So it is political to me in that way.
So within this idea of things are disintegrating, they're collapsing, this is a moment of change and regeneration that's made possible. Can you talk a little bit about what you think the regenerative future looks like? I mean, what would be some of the hallmarks of that? Because I think that one of the things that the climate deniers are really effective at is saying, if we move to a world that's more sustainable, you won't have electricity, you won't have television, like they scare people on the basic things in life. And one of the things I think is important is to give people an idea of what that future could look like. So for you, what are the pillars of a more sustainable or regenerated future?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I came across an article a few months ago by this guy, Kevin Baker, called Where Our New World Begins in Harper's Magazine. And it really was very powerful. He actually went back and looked at, compared the Green New Deal now to the 30s and what the New Deal actually did. And it's really stunning because it was every bit as much an ecological collapse as an economic collapse. 5/6 of the animal populations were already gone from the Americas, about the same numbers for trees that had been cleared. I mean, just one after another.
Wow.
The whole continent had been stripped of the biosphere, basically. And then hundreds of millions of acres of arable farmland, arable land, blew away
That's
in the
right.
wind from basically overdevelopment, again, capitalism. And so what they did is they actually went out and created the Soil Conservation Service, which went on site with farmers. There were 500 soil management stations where they worked directly with farmers doing things like terrace farming and contour farming and actually regenerating the soil. And they were able to ultimately regenerate about half the land that had been degraded. You had people, 3 million people were hired to go plant 3 billion trees. They brought electricity to places that had none. I mean, millions and millions of people. Public health measures, wiped out malaria. There were no libraries in large parts of the country. This woman named Mary Utopia Rothrock, aka Topi. Utopia, I thought that was a great name. Anyway, she brought libraries to all these communities that had never had one, and on and on. And, so when you look at the playing field now, doing the right thing for the climate means doing the right thing for every aspect of society. I mean, we could be employing, there's no lack of work to do. There is so much work to do. And this is not stuff that's going to be done by robots and AI. You need people planting trees,
Right.
and we need the jobs. So you need people retrofitting homes. I mean,
That's right.
it just goes on and on. I was thinking, what if we had a department of watersheds, a department of,
Wow.
restorative justice, not a department of justice, but restorative justice, a department of ecology, a department of biodiversity. I mean, how many people could we be employing to restore the ecosystems on which all wealth depends, in fact, as well as our lives, and then restoring the social fabric and the fabric of community. And one of the other huge things in the New Deal was massive programs of artists. I'd like to see a Department of the Interior that's staffed by psychologists, therapists, and artists. What about that?
Yeah. Yeah.
And we're dealing with so much trauma, and it's not going to let up. I mean, no matter what we do, we're in for it here. It's
Right.
going to be rough, and there's going to be huge,
Dislocation.
dislocation, migration, all that. Yeah.
So, is the Green New Deal enough? Do you think that, given what you were saying, that we can't freeze where we are, we've got to begin to sequester carbon and put it back in the ground and put it back in some respect? So, does the Green New Deal, is it bold enough for right now, or is it a reflection of the art of the most art of the possible right now? It's the best that we could do if our political system was functioning.
I think that it's formative, and part of what happened in the original New Deal was they were improvising. They were making it up as they went along,
That's
and people
true.
hadn't actually tackled problems like these before. So the art of the possible is always how much people are behind you and what can get done in that way. How much people will get behind specific things. But I think there's going to be a moment, if we can change the politics here quickly, which is the real question.
Right.
I think that it's going to be a wildly creative moment. I mean, that's one of our hopes with Bioneers. We're having several in-depth sessions this weekend on the Green New Deal with really brilliant people coming from very different vantage points to try to really embolden that vision even further. Because still what's been missing, is a really deep understanding of ecology and the kind of, the art of ecology in that way, the art of biomimicry. I mean, there's so many,
Right.
natural systems. We need to be training hundreds of thousands of ecologists and biologists and botanists and, on down the line here. So it's a question of whether that vision, I agree with you, it needs to be quite bold, and we're hoping to get, some of the voices of the Bioneers into that mix.
So, if we're able to, you mentioned, so there's the Green New Deal, which is about the way we restructure our economy in order for it to become more sustainable, which means that we would essentially have to change everything, and that creates a lot of opportunities, right? Which is all good. But as we do that, that would essentially freeze our carbon levels at where they are, bring them down slightly. But you are arguing that we should be in a place where we do more than that. What do those things look like?
Yeah, well, again, this is the Paul Hawken project, the drawdown thing. But paradoxically, there are things that are just really, really straightforward in terms of carbon farming. Land management practices are huge. Tree planting, carbon farming, putting carbon back in the soil.
Right. There's some idea to pay farmers, right, to put carbon back in the soil.
Yeah, and it's being done already. There are actually government subsidies for farmers to do that, and they're all in. Putting renewable energy on farms. But two of the top, if you combine them, I think it's either number one or number two, but basically educating women and girls and family planning.
Right.
I mean, those are at the top of the list if you want to draw down carbon.
That's
because
right.
women have fewer children and are able to contribute more to society in that way in terms of work. So, and then there's stuff like refrigerants, but, we actually have the hit list. We have the menu for exactly what to go after, and it's all off-the-shelf technologies. Nothing new needs to be invented. So it's all completely doable.
Right. I mean, the fascinating thing is that that's been the case for almost 15 years, right? I mean, I think that I know that I think the Rocky Mountain Institute put out a report in 2009 or so where, there was a way for us to be able to totally revolutionize our economy and get to carbon neutrality well before 2050,
Oh, yeah.
right? I mean,
Yeah.
they were all, and that was 10 years ago, And so I think that we've been there for a while, but it's this, so I'm wondering, we're focusing on the Green New Deal, which is really important. But the ideas are essentially the same, right? They haven't essentially changed.
In what sense?
So, in terms of doing the menu of things that we need to do in order to create a more sustainable economy, in terms of retrofitting homes, changing the way in which getting people out of cars, having cars that have less gasoline, the way in which we farm, the menu of things that we would need to do to get there hasn't essentially changed. So I'm wondering, in what way do we think that, is the Green New Deal essentially marketing? Is that what's different about it? Or you think that it's fundamentally different than things that you've heard before because you've been doing this for 30 years?
Sure. Well, I think if it's done right, it will be much more holistic than that. And part of it is really what's predominantly driving the destruction of the planet is corporate rule and is just money, at that level, and the concentration of wealth. So I think integral to this is going to have to be the political economics and actually changing the economic system. So some of the work, for example, some of the leading work is a group called the Democracy Collaborative, Gar Alperowitz and a coterie of people there. But for example, the corporate economy is basically hit and run. So a corporation will come into a city or a community, get enormous subsidies, tax breaks. 10 years later, they pull up stakes and leave. It's pretty much of a hit and run deal. And so what their countervailing model is to work with what they call anchor institutions, which are rooted in community. So that it's called EDS and MEDS, hospitals and educational institutions. They can then assign long-term contracts that provide security and stability for example, for a green cleaning company that's worker owned, which was done in Cleveland. They have multiple things like this. There's a huge alliance of anchor institutions of healthcare institutions now that's going national. And all of these can actually create co-ops, worker-owned businesses. You know, it's about shifting the ownership structure ultimately to be much more distributed ownership. And that is going to be integral, or else we're just going to be in the same cycle of the quarterly returns and, you know, more bubbles. So
you have brought up several times the political atmosphere as an essential ingredient to how we got here and how we get out of this certain situation. We just can't. And even when we were talking about ancient civilizations, you mentioned the role of the elites in undermining the environment and sustainability has been essential in that demise. When you look out on the political landscape right now and look at the two parties, which are the vehicles that we have now for political engagement in the United States, for better or for worse, of course, there's one party in which now the front runner is decidedly anti-corporate, right? And decidedly has a theory of change that the role of the government is to check corporate power, and that has 50 plans across various sectors to do that. And then there is another party that is wholly devoted to corporations outright, explicitly, and whose leader is a CEO and former CEO of a corporation with a dubious past, but still nonetheless. And I'm wondering, if we continue to have this mix and with the constitutional arrangements that we have in this country, which allow, if you have one branch or two branches of government, to be able to hijack the entire arrangement, that if we continue to have a party that is wholly devoted to corporate interest, wholly devoted to elites, what is the prospect for making any progress politically?
Well, I don't think it is going to stay this way, for one thing. And I would just, if I could add some context
of course,
to what
please
you're
do.
saying.
Yeah, 100%.
For one thing, Elizabeth Warren is, self-described, arch capitalist. So
Right.
she's not against capitalism in any sense. She's into a regulatory state. Just to be clear about that.
True.
And, it's a distorted picture because the Republican Party, which Chomsky called the most dangerous organization
Right.
in the history of human civilization,
That's right.
which I agree with, has moved so far to the right that the center is to the right now.
Correct.
So the
Correct.
scales are so out of whack that these comparisons are very weird. And there's a group called the Manifesto Project that just did an analysis of political platforms across the world. And the Republican Party is as far right as the most far right populist, xenophobic, anti-Islamic party in Germany. I mean, that's how far
Wow.
gone they are. So let's be clear the context we're talking about here. And, from my perspective, this is kind of terminal capitalism now, and state socialism has equally failed.
Right.
It's not an option. And so what we're really facing is creating something truly new and different that's actually never been done before and has definitely never been done at this scale before.
Right.
And so it's going to be a process of reimagination and reinvention in that way. And, Amory Levin's made a great comment that markets make good servants but bad masters. There's clearly a place for private enterprise. I think that makes a lot of sense. There's other places that should simply be for the public good, that are the
Correct.
commons, that are publicly owned, or monopolies, these things that are, if they're too big to fail, then they're too big. It's real easy to remember.
Right.
They become public utilities or you break them up, So that's the type of politics I think we're going to enter. And also, to me, in some ways, the greatest inspiration and hope I'm getting right now is from young people. Having come of age in the 60s and been part of all that, this is so much bigger and they're so much more woke and aware and sophisticated than we were, decades ago. And, this is existential for them. This is life and death. There is no future if we keep going the direction we're going. So the numbers of young people rising up, the wisdom that they're showing, and the absolute unwavering commitment, they're not going to be turned back.
Yeah.
There's just no way. So I think we're going to witness the end of the two-party system, actually. I don't believe it's going to last a whole lot longer. I don't know if that's good or bad, or Parliamentary systems are much better where you get proportional representation. So I think those are the kinds of changes that'll start to be on the table now in a way that really hasn't been possible, for a very long time. So
Well, and actually, to your point, I mean, I think you are emphasizing that we need to change and that we will change in big ways across the board. But you pointed out earlier that in the New Deal, we made it up as we went along, which means that the people that we are bringing together, the people that we are investing in, the people that are going to lead us there are the thing that we need to be focused on, and that's one of the things that Bioneers is really focused on. And I would imagine that when you talk about seeding the field, that it is this idea of the people that we're investing in who are going to be the ones that create this new future.
yeah, no, exactly, exactly. And to me, the biggest kind of gnarliest area, it's what John Powell's work is about, is the whole process of othering and marginalization or deleting people. I mean, that's the biggest danger, especially as chaos ensues and there's suffering and there's the fear of scarcity and all this type of stuff. So to me, that's the cutting edge of whether we're going to make it or not. If we can truly recognize and celebrate that interbeing and recognize that we're in this together, unless if your idea is that heaven is a gated community, even if it's hell on earth, that's pretty clear where that's going to lead. So, that's the choice we face, and that's the hardest one, which I think, a lot of the work that Nina Simons does with Bioneers is about reaching out across those kinds of differences. And, I think that's a lot of where this really has to go. And building empathy, we need to be not only cultivating empathy, but teaching it.
That's
we
right.
don't we don't know about empathy.
That's right.
Did you ever learn about it in school?
No.
Yeah.
That's right. Well, thank you for building a vehicle that is helping us to imagine the future, to see the people, and take us to the places where they are by bringing them here to share their experiences about how we might do things differently, and for your continued steady vision at a time of chaos. You seem so calm.
Oh, yeah. What can I say?
You seem so calm.
Not at 3 a.m. in the morning.
Right. Or when you read the latest tweet. But
Yeah.
right now you're calm.
Right now I'm calm.
Thank you so much for
Thank
joining
you.
us.
Pleasure.
And thank you for joining us, and stay tuned more for FSTV special coverage of the 30th annual Bioneers Conference.